The smell of motor oil never really leaves your hands. I've scrubbed them 1,000 times over the years. With dish soap, with that orange mechanics paste they sell at AutoZone, with plain hot water until my knuckles cracked in winter. But if you look close enough, you can still see it, settled into the lines of my palms underneath my fingernails, worked into the skin like a second layer. My son used to say it embarrassed him when I picked him up from school. He'd sit in the passenger seat of my old Chevy and press himself against the door, as far from me as the cab would allow. I thought about that on the morning of his IPO. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my motel room, not the hotel where the rest of the guests were staying, because my son had explained very carefully that those rooms were reserved for investors and partners, and I buttoned my shirt slowly. It was a good shirt. I'd bought it 2 years ago from my neighbor Dale's funeral. White, with small blue stripes, the kind that doesn't wrinkle too bad if you hang it up right after the dryer. I'd pressed my slacks the night before using the iron bolted to the wall on a little fold-out board. I polished my shoes with a paper towel and a dab of the complimentary hand lotion on the bathroom counter. I looked at myself for a long moment. 61 years old. Gray at the temples, hands that had changed brake pads and transmission fluid and rotors for 34 years at the same shop in Denton, Texas. I didn't look like the fathers of the other people who would be in that room. I knew that. But my son had called me 3 weeks earlier and said, "Dad, I want you there. It's important to me." And I had believed him, because I always believed him, because that is what fathers do. I turned off the bathroom light and picked up my room key. Outside, the Atlanta morning was already thick with July heat, the kind that sits on your chest. I'd driven 11 hours from Denton to be here, because the flight would have cost $400 each way, and I was 2 months from paying off the last of the credit card debt I'd run up when my son was finishing his MBA at Wharton. He didn't know about that card. I'd never told him. I just kept paying it down, the $150 a month, for 6 years. The launch event was being held at a venue called the Whitmore, downtown. One of those converted warehouse spaces with exposed brick and Edison bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and bartenders who pour exactly 1.5 fingers of bourbon and look at you like they're doing you a personal favor. I found parking 3 blocks away and walked. My dress shoes weren't made for distance. By the time I pushed through the glass doors, I could feel a blister forming on my left heel. The room was already full. I'd guess 300 people, maybe more. Men in suits that cost more than my monthly rent. Women in dresses I couldn't put a price on. Waitstaff moving through the crowd with trays of things I didn't recognize. On a raised platform at the far end of the room, there was a large screen showing the company logo. My son's company, Callaway Analytics, and beneath it, a podium draped in the company's colors, navy and silver. I stood near the entrance for a moment, trying to get my bearings. "Dad." I turned. My son was moving toward me through the crowd, and my first instinct, the one I've had since he was 4 years old, was to smile. He looked like success. He'd always been a handsome kid, but now he wore it differently, the kind of confidence that comes from having people listen to you in rooms like this one. He was 34. He built Callaway Analytics from a 2-person operation in a Chicago studio apartment to a company that, according to the press release he'd emailed me, was projecting a valuation of $400 million at opening bell the following morning. My boy. But he wasn't smiling back. He reached me and took my elbow. Not warmly, the way you greet someone you're glad to see, and steered me slightly to the left, away from a cluster of men in conversation nearby. "What are you wearing?" he said. His voice was low. I looked down at myself. "My good shirt." I pressed it last, "Dad." He exhaled through his nose. I told you this was a formal event. You said business attire. This is. Business attire means a suit. A real suit. Not. He gestured at me. A short, dismissive motion that took in all of me, from the polished with lotion shoes to the iron slacks to the blue-striped shirt from Dale's funeral. Not this. The men nearby hadn't looked over. I told myself that. I told myself no one had heard. I can stand in the back, I said. You won't even know I'm investors here, Dad. I have media. There's a photographer from the Journal who's going to be taking pictures during my remarks. He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes I didn't have a name for, something that had been building there for years, without me ever finding the right word. I can't have you standing next to me looking like you just came from a garage. The room continued around us. Someone laughed at something on the other side of the space. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes. Okay, I said. I kept my voice even. I'll stand in the back. I think it might be better if you... He stopped, pressed his lips together. There's a hospitality room down the hall. You could watch the live stream from there. I looked at my son. I had driven 11 hours. I had ironed my slacks the night before with the iron bolted to the motel wall. I had 6 more payments left on the credit card. Sure, I said. That's fine. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it that passed quickly. He nodded, straightened his jacket, and turned back toward the room. I watched him go. I stood there for another moment before I turned and walked down the side hallway he'd pointed toward. The hospitality room was small. A folding table with a coffee urn and a tray of pastries, a television mounted on the wall showing the same logo from the main room. 2 folding chairs. I poured myself a cup of coffee, even though my stomach was already sour, and I sat down. Through the wall, I could hear the low rumble of the crowd. I sat there for about 20 minutes before the door opened. The man who walked in was somewhere in his mid-60s, trim, with the kind of posture that doesn't come from yoga or a gym membership, but from some earlier discipline, some long-ago training that had restructured the bones. His suit was charcoal gray and very quiet about how expensive it was. Silver at the temples. A face that had been outdoors a great deal over a long life. He looked at the coffee urn, then at me, and he said, "Mind if I join you? It's a little loud out there for my taste." "Go ahead," I said. He poured himself a coffee and sat in the other folding chair. We watched the television for a moment. On screen, a coordinator was adjusting the microphone at the podium. "You with the firm?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm Marcus's father." He turned to look at me. Something moved across his face, but he didn't say anything right away. He just nodded slowly and looked back at the screen. "Tom Whitfield," he said, and held out his hand. I shook it. "Gerald Calloway?" "Gerald," he repeated, like he was filing it away. "How far'd you come?" "Drove up from Denton, Texas." "Long drive." "Yes." We sat quietly for another moment. Out in the main room, someone was tapping the microphone. "You worked with Marcus?" I asked. "In a manner of speaking." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I'm on the board at Meridian Capital. We led the Series B round." He paused. $40 million. I nodded like I knew what that meant, which I did, roughly. I'd looked things up before I came. "That's a significant investment." "It is." He looked at me again. "So why are you in here watching it on television?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at the screen, where Marcus was now shaking hands with someone near the podium, laughing at something, perfectly at ease. "My shirt wasn't right," I said finally. Tom Whitfield didn't respond to that. He just looked at the screen with me. What do you do, Gerald? I'm a mechanic, 34 years at the same shop. I paused. I'm retiring at the end of the year, actually. Shop's being sold. New owners are bringing in their own guys. 34 years at one place, he said. That's not something you see much anymore. No, I agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Marcus ever talk about you? Where he came from? I thought about how to answer that, honestly. He doesn't talk about Denton much. I think he's worked hard to, I searched for the right word, recontextualize his background. Tom Whitfield made a small sound that might have been a laugh. I put him through college on a mechanic's salary, I said. I wasn't sure why I said it. Maybe because I was sitting in a folding chair in a hospitality room drinking bad coffee while 300 people celebrated my son 11 feet away. Took every overtime shift the shop would give me, weekends, holidays. 14 years of that. Community college first, then the transfer to UT, then Wharton. I wrapped both hands around the paper cup. I'm proud of him. I want to be clear about that. I'm very proud of him. But, Tom said quietly. The door opened before I could answer. Marcus was standing in the doorway. His eyes went from me to Tom Whitfield and back, and I watched the sequence of calculations move across his face. Recognition, confusion, recalibration. Tom, he said, his voice switching registers immediately, warming several degrees. I was looking for you. They're about to. I found your father, Tom said pleasantly. He was keeping me company. Seems he drove 11 hours to be here. Marcus laughed, the social laugh, the one that meant nothing. Yeah, Dad's always been, he likes to drive, so 11 hours, Tom said again. Not unkindly, just placing it in the room. Marcus looked at me. We were going to have you watch from... Sit down, Marcus, Tom said. The room went quiet in a specific way. Tom hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved from his folding chair. But Marcus stopped talking and looked at him with an expression I had never seen on my son's face before, not once in 34 years. Marcus sat down on the edge of the folding table. Your father was just telling me about the overtime shifts, Tom said. 14 years, was it, Gerald? About that, yes, weekends and holidays. Tom looked at Marcus with an expression that was completely neutral, which somehow made it worse. And Wharton, that's not an inexpensive school. Tom, I really think we should get back out there before the program doesn't start for 8 minutes. He turned his coffee cup in his hands again. I grew up in Bakersfield, California. My father was a pipe fitter. You know what a pipe fitter does? Marcus said nothing. He fits pipes, Tom said. In industrial facilities mostly. Refineries. It's hot, physical, dangerous work. He wore work clothes every day of his life. When I made my first million, I flew him out to San Francisco for a dinner. He wore the best shirt he owned. Tom paused. Do you know where I'd put him? The room was completely silent except for the muffled sound of the crowd beyond the wall. At the table closest to the kitchen, Tom said, away from my investors. Because I was 29 years old and I thought his shirt would reflect poorly on me. He set his coffee cup down on the folding table. You want to know the one regret I carry from that entire decade? Marcus was very still. I've never forgiven myself for that dinner, Tom said. Not once, not in 30 years. He stood up and smoothed the front of his charcoal jacket. Gerald, I'd like you to sit in the front row, with me. He looked at Marcus with the same neutral expression. And Marcus, I think you might want to reconsider how you're structuring your remarks, specifically the part about being a self-made man. Because I've found that phrase tends to reveal a great deal about what a person has chosen to forget. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at me. Shall we? I stood up. I could feel my son's eyes on my back as we walked out the door. The next 20 minutes were the strangest of my life. Tom Whitfield walked me through that room like he was walking a colleague through it, stopping to introduce me to 3 different people. A venture partner from New York, a tech editor from a publication I'd heard of, a woman named Sandra who, it turned out, sat on the boards of 2 Fortune 500 companies, and in each case he said, "This is Gerald Calloway, Marcus's father. He drove 11 hours from Texas to be here, and each time the people he introduced me to shook my hand and said something genuine, because Tom Whitfield's attention directed their attention, and what Tom Whitfield's attention directed their attention, and what Tom Whitfield found worth noting." I sat in the front row. Tom sat beside me. When Marcus came out to the podium 10 minutes later, I watched him look out at the room and find my face. Front row, next to the man who had written his company a $40 million check. I watched him absorb that. I watched him rebuild his expression into something controlled and steady, the way I had watched him, when he was 7 years old, rebuild his expression after falling off his bicycle in front of the kids on the next block. That same pride, that same gathering of composure. He gave his remarks. They were good. He was eloquent and confident and precise, and I felt the same thing I always felt watching my son perform. A complicated, overwhelming love that didn't require anything from him in return, that had never required anything from him in return, that had never required anything. Toward the end, where I assume he had planned to say what he usually said in those rooms, the bootstrapped narrative, the self-made arc, the story of one man's vision. He paused, and he looked at me, and he said, "The truth is, none of this begins with me. It begins with a man who worked overtime every weekend for 14 years so I could sit in classrooms he would never see, who drove 11 hours this morning so he could be in this room." He stopped. The room was quiet. "My dad is here today, Gerald Calloway." He's sitting in the front row. He looked directly at me. "Dad, his voice caught. Just for a moment. He pressed his lips together and then he said, "I don't say this enough. I don't think I've ever said it clearly enough. But everything in this room started with you." 300 people turned to look at me. I am 61 years old. I have worked with my hands for 34 years. I am not a man who cries in public. I was very close to it. After the program, I found a quiet spot near the bar. Not drinking, just standing, and my son came to me. He didn't have the social face on anymore. He just looked like Marcus. He looked, for a moment, like he was 13 years old and had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball and needed to tell me about it. "I'm sorry about earlier," he said. "The shirt thing." "It's a good shirt," I said. A short breath came out of him, somewhere between a laugh and something else. "It is a good shirt, Dad." We stood there for a moment. "Tom told me what he said," Marcus said, "in the hospitality room. He didn't have to do that." "No," Marcus agreed. "He didn't. He looked at his shoes briefly, then back at me. I've been." He stopped and started again. "I think I've been trying for a long time to put distance between where I came from and where I am. And I told myself it was about focus, about building something. But I think." He paused again, and I could see him working through it in real time. The way he had always worked through hard things, slowly and carefully. "I think I was ashamed. Of Denton. Of the shop. Of me," I said quietly, not unkindly. He looked at me steadily. "Yes," he said, "sometimes. And I'm deeply ashamed of that, now, standing here." He shook his head. "I had you watch from a back room." "You didn't know Tom Whitfield grew up in Bakersfield," I said. Another short exhale. No, I did not know that. He was quiet for a moment. He wants to have dinner with us, you and me. Tomorrow morning he's flying back to New York, and he asked if we'd have breakfast with him before he leaves. A mechanic from Denton and a board member at Meridian Capital, I said. Apparently, Tom thinks that's a fine combination. He looked at me. Will you stay? I know you drove up and you probably wanted to. I already paid for 2 nights, I said. The motel rate was better for 2. Something crossed his face. A small grief, quick and private. I'll pay for the motel, Dad. You don't need to do, please, he said. Not formally, just honestly. Let me pay for the motel. I looked at my son. $400 million company. Front page of the business section tomorrow morning. The best shirt I owned. All right, I said. You can pay for the motel. We had breakfast with Tom Whitfield the next morning at a place he chose near the hotel. A diner with red vinyl booths and coffee in ceramic mugs. The kind of place that doesn't require you to know which fork is which. I thought that was deliberate on his part. Marcus noticed it too. I could tell from the way his shoulders dropped slightly when we walked in, something releasing. Tom ordered eggs over easy. I ordered the same. Marcus, who I knew from holidays, ate almost no breakfast, ordered a full plate of pancakes and ate most of them. At one point, Tom looked at me and said, Gerald, Marcus tells me you're retiring end of the year. Shop's being sold, so, yes, that's the plan. What are you going to do with yourself? I'd thought about this. I'd thought about it a great deal in the quiet of the last few months, in the particular silence of a life that has organized itself entirely around work and around a child who no longer needs you, and finding that both of those structures were ending at roughly the same time. I have a small house, I said. Good neighbors. I'd like to take a road trip, actually, see some of the country. I've spent a lot of time in Texas. I paused. I've always wanted to see the coast. Oregon, maybe. Washington State. Tom nodded. You'd love the Olympic Peninsula. So I've heard. Marcus was watching me across the table with an expression I recognized from when he was very small. A look of concentrated attention, taking something in. I'd like to come, he said. I looked at him. On the road trip. He shifted in his seat slightly, the way he did when he wasn't sure how something would land. Not the whole thing, obviously, but a stretch of it, if you'd want company. I looked at my son for a long moment. 34 years old. Company valuation on the front page. Pancakes half-eaten. You'd have to ride in my Chevy, I said. I know. It smells like motor oil. I know, Dad. I picked up my coffee mug. Outside the window, Atlanta was moving through its morning, ordinary and unhurried. All right, I said. Oregon in September, then. Tom Whitfield smiled into his eggs. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. My son called me 3 days after I got back to Denton. He called just to talk, which he hadn't done in a long time. Usually our calls had a purpose, a logistical center, something to confirm or arrange. This one didn't. He called on a Tuesday evening and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing important. My neighbor Dale's widow, who had started growing tomatoes, a noise his car was making that I diagnosed over the phone as probably a heat shield. A documentary he'd watched about the Dust Bowl that he thought I'd like. At the end of the call, before we hung up, he said, I'm going to do better, Dad. I just want you to know that. I was sitting in my kitchen. The light was going outside. Through the window I could see the end of my driveway, the oil stain on the concrete where I'd changed my own brakes last spring. I know you will, I said. I should have, Marcus. I waited until I knew he was listening. I didn't drive 11 hours to collect an apology. I drove 11 hours because you're my son and I wanted to be there. I let that sit for a moment. That's the whole story. The line was quiet for a few seconds. "Okay, Dad," he said finally. His voice was different. Younger, somehow. "Okay." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while in the quiet. I looked at my hands, the lines in my palms, the ghost of motor oil that never quite comes out. No matter how long you scrub, 34 years of honest work written into the skin. I have never once been ashamed of them. I don't think my son will be again, either. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that morning in Atlanta. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, where everything snaps into place in a single moment. The real kind is quieter. It accumulates over years, the way oil works itself into the lines of your hands, slowly, invisibly, until one day you look down and realize it's just part of you now. Gerald spent 34 years showing up. That's the whole story, if you strip everything else away. He didn't show up because someone was watching, or because he expected a reward at the end of it. He showed up because that's what integrity actually looks like when you remove the audience. It looks like overtime on holidays. It looks like a credit card paid down $150 at a time for 6 years in silence. It looks like ironing your best shirt on a motel wall, iron and driving 11 hours because your son asked you to be there and you still believed him. That kind of consistency doesn't go unnoticed forever. It can't. The choices we make every day are building something whether we intend them to or not. A structure of character that eventually becomes impossible to ignore, even by the people who have been working hardest not to see it. Marcus built a company that took real intelligence, real drive, real courage. Nobody handed him that boardroom or that valuation, but somewhere along the way, he made a different kind of choice. The choice to rewrite his own origin story, to put distance between who he was becoming and where he had come from. He told himself that was ambition. What it actually was fear. Fear that the men in expensive suits would see the oil stain on the driveway and measure him by it. The thing about that kind of fear is that it costs you more than it protects you. It cost Marcus a front row seat with his father on the most important morning of his professional life. It cost him the truth of his own story, which was actually a far more powerful story than the one he'd been telling. A son of a mechanic from Denton, Texas, who built a $400 million company. That's not a story to hide. That is the story. But he couldn't see it until someone he respected held up a mirror. That's what Tom Whitfield gave him. Not money, not connections. A mirror. And what Gerald gave him, without ever intending to, without ever demanding anything in return, was a foundation solid enough to still be standing when the mirror finally appeared. There is a version of this story where Gerald stays in that hospitality room, where he drinks his bad coffee, watches the live stream alone, drives back to Denton, and never says a word about it to anyone. That version exists because he was always willing to make himself small for his son's comfort. But what he could never make small was what he had actually built. And eventually the truth of that found its way into the room whether anyone invited it or not. That's not luck. That's not coincidence. That is simply what happens when a person lives with their whole character over a long period of time. The work doesn't disappear. The sacrifice doesn't disappear. It waits, patient and permanent, until the moment arrives when it can no longer be overlooked. What we choose to do in the quiet, when nobody is grading us, when there is no audience, when the only person who knows is ourselves. That is the thing that ultimately defines every outcome that follows. Gerald knew that. He'd known it his whole life. He just never thought he'd have to prove it at a venue with Edison bulbs and 300 strangers watching. But he didn't have to prove anything. He already had. The proof was 34 years old, sitting across from him at a diner in Atlanta, eating a full plate of pancakes and asking if he could come to Oregon in September. That's the whole story.